I'm Uriah Heep. I'm the host of the Great American Novel Series, brought to you by The Author's Matrix. And today, we have a brand new novel from a brand new author. It's an interesting novel. It's a little different. I think you'll like it, though. It's, well, some people may say it's a little hard to swallow. You'll understand why in a minute. Anyway, the book is called The Village Idiot by Dan Blanchfield. So, let's dive into chapter 1. Sit back, relax, get a cup of coffee, a cup of hot chocolate, enjoy the ambiance of my literary cafe here, and listen to chapter 1. I'll see you on the other side.
Chapter 1. The village of Crumbly, England, sits in the verdant valley some 40 kilometres west of the great city of London. It was first inhabited many centuries ago, and some of the descendants from those early days still grace its rolling hills and lush countryside. The city centre has been built over the centuries and is now a monument to the modern age. Although the title of village still adorns the city hall, the population exceeds many of the other villages in that part of England. The good people of Crumbly are like people everywhere. They are industrious, well-mannered, and plough through life despite difficulties. Of course, they gossip, as one would expect wherever people gather, but not more than the average Londoner on a foggy afternoon. On the whole, they seem pleased with their gruesome existence. There is a statue in the main square, directly across from the aforementioned City Hall, of one Aldous Crumbly, known as the founding father of Crumbly. His bronze statue, faded, weathered, and turned a macabre greenish colour by the harsh winters of Crumbly, stands as a testament to the courage and fortitude of the inhabitants of Crumbly. Every day, people pass by that statue and pause, admiring the steady gaze of one Aldous Crumbly as he peers off into the distance. On a cloudy, dismal day in early spring, one of the only remaining direct descendants of Aldous Crumbly was the individual staring up at the statue of his great-great-great, and so many more, great-grandfather. Jonah Crumbly's claim as a living relative of Crumbly's founding father was an enormous source of pride for Jonah. The bitter March wind cut through Jonah, but he persisted in his mindless gaze. He was a man of nearly 40, although his looks belied a man far beyond his years. His hair, matted and falling out in chunks, had begun this process as he reached his third decade. Although he was gaunt and had eyes sunken into his head, his remaining teeth were still strong and were occasionally on display when he smiled grimly. After enduring sufficient discomfort, Jonah decided it was time to move on to his afternoon tasks, so he would be home for supper. His wife, Edith, anxiously awaited his arrival while she cleaned their modest house on the main road and prepared the family's meal. The Crumbly's eldest child, Nigel, some 2 years Annie's elder, was still at school but was expected shortly. Annie, the precocious 8-year-old, was remanded to her sick bed as her fever spiked the previous evening. Annie was generally a sickly child, gaunt like her father, pallid, and had difficulty walking. "Hello, Mother!" cried Jonah as he entered the house of his birth. Mrs. Crumbly lumbered into the living room to greet her husband, but the look on her ashen face revealed a foreboding terror. While she managed to keep herself busy these past hours with mindless household chores, her frequent checks on dear Annie heightened her growing concern that her only remaining daughter's illness was progressing. "How's Annie?" asked Jonah as he tore off his muddied boots. He saw the look on his wife's face and surmised that Annie's health had worsened since he left the house earlier in the morning. "Why are you not by her side?" Jonah asked incredulously. Edith had no reply. Instead, she grabbed her husband by the elbow and ushered him into the back room, where Annie lay still. Her chest expanded and contracted in a laboured manner, but still, there was the motion of life within her. Jonah sat down on the side of Annie's bed, took the damp cloth from the wash bin, and pressed it against her forehead. "She's burning up again, Edith," stammered Jonah. Her sores have grown since I left, Jonah continued with an underlying resentment of his wife's neglect. Nigel returned from school and entered the back room where the family gathered. His first glance met the sunken eyes of his little sister, and he fought back tears. As he dropped his books on a chair nearby, his parents looked up in unison at their only remaining son, saying nothing, acknowledging him not, and returned their attention to little Annie. Annie stirred a bit, and her eyes opened. They were vacant and gave little indication that there was still life behind them. She tried to open her mouth to speak. Despite her efforts, her lips were dry and brittle, and no words ushered forth. "Don't just stand there looking foolish, Nigel," bellowed Jonah. "Go outside and fetch some fresh sewer water for your sister. Blasted boy, can't you see she's parched?" It was as if Nigel's fault that his sister lay on her deathbed. Nigel obeyed and raced out of the house with a bucket in hand, and made his way across the street to the open trench that supplied the residents of this neighbourhood with their raw sewage water. Nigel dutifully plunged his bucket into the murky, rotten stench of the canal, scooped out a gallon of raw sewage, and returned to the house. As he hurriedly traversed the front door, his bucket sloshed about, spilling fecal matter behind him, leaving a trail extending to the backroom entrance. Nigel placed the bucket next to his father's feet, where Mr. Crumbly generously soaked the soiled cloth until every fibre had absorbed the putrid sewer water. Carefully, Jonah opened his daughter's lips slightly, hovered the fabric over them, and gently squeezed a few drops into her mouth. Annie twitched as the raw sewage met her tongue, but she swallowed what she could before vomiting the rest onto Jonah. "Go run and fetch the doctor, Nigel," Jonah commanded. "There is no time to waste. Our dear little girl is fading before our very eyes." Jonah wiped a lone tear he found running down his cheek as he turned from his wife so as not to display any weakness she would scorn. Nigel obeyed, and within the hour, the doctor had graced the Crumbly household and was at Annie's bedside. Dr. Mangus Atterbury, a man of great import, stood erect over the beloved daughter of Edith and Jonah Crumbly. It was not the first time the good doctor stood at the bedside of a dying child in the village of Crumbly. He had lain to rest far more than he hoped to recall. However, this one lying before him, emaciated, fragile, and hopeless, took its toll on Dr. Atterbury. After a cursory examination that yielded nothing, he excused himself from the room and made his way to the street outside the Crumbly household, where he wept uncontrollably for what seemed to him like an eternity. Forlorn himself, Dr. Atterbury summoned the courage to re-enter the house and took his place in the back room, where he placed himself at the foot of the dying child's bed and began to explain to the parents that all hope was lost. "Be that God would give us a miracle," Dr. Atterbury began. "But I am heartbroken to say that our dear little Annie will be joining her elder sisters and brothers in the great beyond before the sun rises on another day." It is not as though the Crumbleys were surprised by the news, as they had buried numerous children over the past decade that went the way of Annie. This was their fate that God had decided, and they accepted this fate for Annie. "All you can do," Dr. Atterbury concluded, "is to continue to slowly drip the raw sewage water past her parched lips, as you have been doing, and cleanse her wounds with the same." The doctor had no more to say, bid this family goodbye, and left hurriedly. "We shall call the pastor," exclaimed Jonah. "If Annie's life is to be in God's hands, then so be it. God will be present, and if a miracle is to be forthcoming, we will all rejoice in his name." Nigel did not wait for another command from his father. The 10-year-old son of Jonah and Edith grew up in a house of faith, and without hesitation, he made his way to the church at the end of the street to summon Pastor Blythe to his little sister's deathbed. In the moments between Dr. Atterbury's exit and Pastor Blythe's entrance, it seemed as if Annie had rallied. Her eyes were open now, and she seemed to recognize the family members at her bedside. She could not speak, but it was not for lack of effort. Her father tried to quiet her, placed his hand on her forehead, and stroked her remaining hair with the gentleness of an angel. She tried to smile but coughed up refuse from her lungs and closed her eyes again. Pastor Blythe, if he was anything, was a man of faith, at least outwardly. He could preach a sermon on Sunday mornings that stirred his congregation, and it was not unusual for members to leave the church simultaneously praising God and weeping as they clutched each other to share the experience. The pastor liked this power and secretly arranged these sermons to bring about this effect on his people. He would stand outside his church as his congregation filed out, shaking hands, embracing the women, and sometimes weeping with them if he deemed appropriate. As he entered the back room of the Crumbly house, Pastor Blythe recognized the spectre of one Annie lying in her bed, barely clutching life. Standing well over 6 feet tall and weighing half the weight one would expect on such a man, the pastor moved closer to the bed and placed his hand on Jonah's shoulder while he looked at poor Edith. He attempted a reassuring smile, but Edith would have none of it. She was always deeply suspicious of Pastor Blythe, and this was no time for her to reconsider her opinion of the supposed man of God standing before her. She turned her head away from the pastor and looked again at her dear Annie. "Has she had enough raw sewage water, Jonah?" was Pastor Blythe's first question. "I see you have a full bucket here." The pastor did not know what needed to be said at this moment, so he continued to babble. "We need to be grateful to the Lord that we have such a ready supply of raw sewage water." Jonah and Edith ignored the pastor. Perhaps the life-giving restorative power of fresh, raw sewage water is just the thing our dear little Annie needs now to bring her back from the brink, the pastor continued to babble. As Pastor Blythe was merely a preacher and not a man of medicine, his words were worthless. He was there to give his blessing, not dispense medical advice, and both Jonah and Edith resented his commentary. They both knew as well as anyone the restorative power of raw sewage water, as it was standard knowledge, and had been giving Annie as much as she could consume. However, Annie continued to suffer before their eyes, and weakened with every hour that passed. "If you could just say a prayer, Pastor," Jonah said, "that would be enough." Pastor Blythe, feeling the sting of criticism in Jonah's dismissive attitude towards his acumen in the field of medicine, brushed his hair back and began, "Father in heaven, blessed be this child of yours." With his head bowed, Jonah turned to make sure Nigel paid sufficient homage to the preacher's words, regardless of how hollow he might have felt them to be. "This beautiful child," Pastor Blythe continued, "is your humble servant, and she requires your intervention now. As a preacher, myself blessed with the power of the Holy Spirit, I command this illness, which is from the devil himself, be gone." The following morning, Jonah awoke in the chair astride Annie's bed. The doctor had been wrong, and Annie was still with the Crumbly household, albeit barely. Jonah slowly rose as his back ached from sleeping on the rigid chair and sat beside Annie. He brushed back her hair, which fell out onto her bony shoulder. Jonah tried to place the bits of hair back onto Annie's head and arrange it correctly, but to no avail. The brittle, straw-like hair fell again upon the pillow, and Jonah gave up this pursuit. The room Annie occupied was in the back of the house, and sunlight rarely made its presence felt. The abandoned building that buttressed the back of the Crumbly house blocked any morning light from reaching the only small window in the room. Thus, the bedroom remained grimly dark, even as the sun shone brightly this early spring morning. The shadows cast against the wall from the night lamp looked almost evil. As Edith entered the room and sat beside her husband, Jonah smiled at her painfully. These parents were grateful that their child had survived the night and hoped to see some restorative power to bring their daughter back into the light, but there was none. "God has spoken," whispered Edith. The pastor's words had failed to move God, and no miracle was forthcoming. "This is his will," Edith continued. "Aye, woman," Jonah said. "Modern science has done all it could for our little Annie. She has had the best care, and we all know that." The words came haltingly from Jonah. He tried to accept the fact that the Crumbleys would, yet again, place one of their children in an early grave. As he and Edith sat quietly on Annie's bed, Jonah thought back to the older siblings who had suffered a similar fate. He almost forgot their names in his grief. "This is the world we live in, Edith," Jonah said to his wife, who was now gently weeping as he placed his withered arm around her. As much of the attention, rightly, was directed at Annie by the family, Jonah himself was suffering too. He had lost weight of late, and his arms reflected this loss. In his youth, Jonah was more robust. He was the only one of his siblings and parents who survived his childhood. "It is time we should eat, Edith," Jonah stated emphatically. "We must keep up our strength as best we can in these trying times." The statement sounded trite to Jonah, even as the words came from his mouth. As Jonah and Edith slowly rose from the bed, Nigel entered the room. He was gladdened to see his little sister not covered in a shroud, as that was his expectation as he went to bed last night. "Your mother is to prepare our breakfast, Nigel," Jonah said quietly. "Go and fetch some fresh sewer water from the trench that she might begin." Nigel obeyed without hesitation, as he was hungry too, and his sister could wait, he reasoned. He dashed out the door with the same bucket from last evening, and went across the street to the sewer trench to fetch the necessary water to prepare the morning meal. This time, Nigel wanted to make sure he scooped the very best water the sewer had to offer and waded into the trench up to his knees, plunging his bucket into the fetid mire. As he filled the bucket to the brim, Nigel waded backward out of the trench and hurried the sewer water to his mother so she could commence preparing the family breakfast. Jonah had started a fire in the house's main room, so it was pleasantly warm when Nigel re-entered. "Bring that to me," commanded Edith as Nigel crossed the threshold. He obeyed and placed the bucket at his mother's feet. She would be preparing porridge this chilly spring morning, so fresh sewer water would be necessary to bring it to fruition. With porridge in the pot and sewer water added, the family meal began to take form, and this pleased Jonah and Nigel. Nigel set the table, and Edith served the feast. Poor Annie was almost forgotten as the three Crumbleys, spoons in hand, dug into their breakfast. Jonah dipped his bread into his porridge and slopped a massive chunk of it into his mouth, savouring the taste and the stench. "'Tis a good meal, woman," Jonah remarked between gulps. Edith glowed as she felt her husband was now pleased with her. That was rarely the case in their 20 years of marriage, and they appreciated the moment, however fleeting. As the three gorged on their meal, Annie stirred in her bed, and a moan was heard in the adjoining room. "That is Annie!" Nigel exclaimed. He dropped his spoon in his bowl and raced to his little sister's side. Jonah and Edith, having heard Annie's moan, both tossed their spoons down and joined their son in her room. "Stay quiet," Jonah whispered as he placed his bony hand on Annie's forehead, trying not to touch the open sore that dominated it. "Your daddy's here, my little angel," Jonah continued as he motioned to Edith to soak the towel in the remaining sewer water left over from preparing the morning meal. He motioned Edith to fetch the bucket and the towel in the kitchen. "Hand it here, woman," Jonah commanded with great authority. Edith obeyed and carefully laid the putrid towel across Annie's forehead. "This will do you good, my dear," Jonah continued, attempting to soothe his daughter. As the sewer water oozed out of the towel and streams ran down Annie's face, she tried to direct some of it into her mouth. "That is a good girl, Annie," Jonah exclaimed with restrained joy. "Try to get some moisture, my little one. It will do you good." This scene continued for an hour, with Jonah and Edith taking turns soaking the towel, patting their daughter's forehead, and occasionally squeezing a few precious drops past her swollen and brittle lips. 3 weeks later, little Annie joined her siblings in the grave. Her death was not sudden, and she fought heroically until the end. But her body had been wasted, poisoned by a source unknown to modern science. Pastor Blythe was there at the end and gave perfunctory blessings to Annie and the family. "We cannot know God's will," Pastor Blythe stated emphatically, if not by rote, to the rest of the family, giving them little comfort in their hour of need. "Indeed," replied Jonah.
So, little Annie is gone. Tragedy has struck the Crumbly family once again. That concludes Chapter 1 of The Village Idiot. Tune in next time for Chapter 2. We find out where the family goes from here. I am Uriah Heep. This is my Literary Cafe, and this is the Great American Novel Series. Goodbye, good luck, and we'll see you next time.